So on the show, when we talked about the federal election, we focused on the media environment Canadians are in right now and about how some non-traditional media organizations are taking up way more space. Today, we're going to focus on one of them, and that's 6ixBuzz. How did 6ixBuzz get so influential? A lot to get into. Let's go. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. Okay, so right now in Canada, you can't see news from the big media organizations like CBC or the Globe and Mail, or any newspaper really, if you're on Facebook or Instagram. And what that has meant is certain media organizations have just had this opportunity to dominate. 6ixBuzz TV has more than 2 million followers. They're controversial. They really commit to these clickbaity headlines and prompts. But still, they came up quite a bit in the election, thanks in no small part to a moment like this one.
Hey everyone, Pierre Polyev here, answering questions for 6ixBuzz.
And I am Anna Polyev here, Pierre's wife, here to ask the questions. What would you do on your first day in office as a Prime Minister?
Well, we are going to axe the federal sales tax on new homes. And we will also...
That is considered leader Pierre Polyev doing a Q&A for 6ixBuzz TV. 6ixBuzz has just become a really big part of the online life for younger audiences. It's where some folks I know get their news from. And I wanted to get into what I see as a controversial rise to prominence. And here to unpack all of this, Matt Amha is here. Joytha Sangupta is here. Matt, Joytha, welcome to the show, y'all. How's it going?
So good.
Going well. Thank you for having us.
I'm ready to do this. Matt, I'm very briefly, what's a 6ixBuzz origin story?
I think we probably have to start by saying that the origin story is shrouded in mystery. Like,
okay.
I believe to this day, the owner, or at least one of their owners, quite literally does not show his face and wears a mask in all public appearances, like literally to this day. But there are two founders. They operate in different capacities. But it was kind of originally like a music blog, essentially. Like they would feature local music from Toronto, sometimes from across Canada. They would feature the kind of content that would pit neighborhoods against one another and kind of place community housing projects into rivalries. But they are a street enterprise run by street guys. That has been clear from the very beginning. And there was just a point at which it kind of went from that. And there would probably what I would describe as like a reverse metamorphosis into now what is basically a troll page and a place for innuendo and slander and all kinds of partisan politics, frankly. So yeah, there's been a little bit of a switch in the last few years.
Joyta, have you ever heard more of a Matt Amha phrase than reverse metamorphosis? I don't think I've ever heard
it's
one.
Up there.
It's up there. Matt, actually, like I want to follow up on that because I do think the thing that you just said about them being street guys who are paying attention to what's happening in the streets is that there was a credibility there. There was a credibility in terms of like the hip hop that they're paying attention to, that just kind of coming out of Toronto and the ways that they paid attention to those neighborhoods. Do you want to talk about that credibility? Because I don't think you get this big without that credibility, at least at the start.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an inherent credibility baked into that kind of relationship that you have with people that you're also one of. You know, like the media, it's often like this top-down thing of these people that really have little relationship with the communities that they're covering. This is particularly true in low-income areas. And these are guys that were from those low-income areas that looked like the people that were from there and knew what we wanted, you know? And so they were able to build this particularly personal relationship with the people they were hoping to turn into customers in many ways.
Joyta, what about you? When did they first come into your radar?
So I was like, gosh, I can't remember a time before 6ixBuzz. I had to actually go back on Instagram and like be like, oh, when did I start following them? It was 2018, early 2018. Yeah. And much like what Matt's talking about, you know, it was the fact that they were covering artists from parts of the city that like you weren't going to see on mainstream media. Yeah. And they were having these conversations, sometimes, you know, problematic, gossipy, that folks from my ends were talking about. So
real people also sounded like that.
Yeah. So it was representative of a version of Toronto that wasn't being seen on mainstream media unless it was in this very like voyeuristic, I would say even perverse way. So the fact that it was coming from people from those areas, it's like immediately I wanted to see what was going to come out of this account. And then, you know, the fact that like you would follow viral moments online from the US or other parts of Canada, but like Toronto's own viral moments now had this platform for us to sort of be in on the joke and see what's going on. Yeah.
It's one thing to build that world. It's another for it to sort of get to the degree that we're at now. Maybe I'll ask this, Matt. Matt, when did 6ixBuzz's sort of these controversial clickbait kind of strategies, when do they sort of start to get the attention of other more traditional media organizations?
So there's a short answer and a long answer. I think the short answer is that there was, frankly, a kind of process of radicalization around COVID. I think around COVID is where we saw the page really start to harden and start to present views that, it felt like a point of view, frankly, and start to develop this point of view. And, COVID, like, mask mandates and like the kind of thing that you would maybe traditionally relate to like a right wing kind of blog page. But through the years, they have been, they kind of developed a kind of cast of characters and people that would appear on the page in different ways. They would break stories that would then be featured in the mainstream press, the kind of stories that the mainstream media ignored or didn't initially see as viable were things that 6ixBuzz were on first. The page also kind of got an air of legitimacy once Drake followed them and started promoting their content. Like, I think pretty quickly after Drake followed, the page exploded from 60,000 to 500,000 followers, right? So that's a direct kind of pre and post Drake cosign that really changed the trajectory of the platform. But I think there's one story in particular of like there was a young girl in Toronto that people who followed the page will recognize. I think I won't necessarily say her name now, but viewers of the page will know. This girl became a kind of like a local avatar. She was highly recognizable. She was like a local celebrity. Yeah. But she was subject to like incredible abuse, like virulent online abuse due to her depiction on this particular page. And, viewers of the page could appear that this was a girl that appeared to be struggling. And like, I'm not in the business of diagnosing anyone, but the conversation every time that she was posted was, I'm not sure this is right. This feels wrong. Why are we laughing at a vulnerable young girl, right? And when she eventually ended up dying of an overdose in Toronto at a shelter at 18 years of age, an incredible tragedy, many people in the city kind of placed some measure of culpability at the feet of a page which had been responsible for her hyper visibility and virality. And, I think, some of these narratives through time expose the complication with going from a kind of, a page that posts, that memifies fights and beefs in the city into a kind of news publication, which is what they consider now. And, the kind of really complicated tension within all of that.
I don't want to jump ahead to the idea of them trying to sort of position themselves as a news organization and a news page, because I do think that comes with its own problems. But even before you get there, as this credibility sort of starts to mount, what you also start to get, Joytha, is like this other troubling part of 6ixBuzz, which is the way that it's kind of consistently exploited these toxic anti-Asian sentiments for its financial bottom line, especially towards Brampton's South Asian communities. Can you talk a little bit about that history of how intentional 6ixBuzz was about that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that like none of this is occurring in a vacuum. Yeah. So the context that we're coming into this with is the fact that like anti-immigration sentiment has already been on the rise in Canada for the last couple of years. Anti-South Asian hate content online has also been on the rise in the last couple of years, and that's globally, not just in Canada. But it's unique when we talk about 6ixBuzz in the sense that like Brampton is sort of considered the epicenter of what people consider to be a quote unquote problem when it comes to over immigration, over representation of South Asians in this community, where we've always been here. Yeah. So the tricky thing with the way 6ixBuzz approaches this is this sort of like feigned neutrality. They'll post something like, Canada's largest cricket dome opening in Brampton. They don't cover cricket. We know what the comments are going to look like. Right.
Go, what do you think?
What do you think, guys? Eyes emoji? Like, it's this lobbing to the trolls in the comments that are going to sort of knock it out of the park for them.
It's playing with an undercurrent that's already kind of there.
Exactly. So it's one of those things where it's like, are they the only ones doing this? No. But when I talk to, in my reporting, international students, newcomers, other young South Asians, particularly in Brampton, 6ixBuzz came up time and time again. And for people that were in some of the most stressful times of their lives, not knowing, whether they were going to be able to stay in this country after spending their life savings to be here, or if they were being sort of, if they were experiencing like racism in real life, being followed, being recorded, they talked about the comments on 6ixBuzz, and they talked about the way that this kind of content was being platformed and rewarded by these platforms.
Matt, what do you make of that? About the idea that 6ixBuzz has kind of become, a central hub for this?
I mean, I think what strikes me most is that this is really a story of betrayal. Like, this is a great betrayal. And, 6ixBuzz was created as a kind of alternative media that was designed to represent the first generation Toronto and Canadian experience and the kind of immigrant experience in this country. And like particularly the experiences and concerns of us that grew up in the so-called inner city, that grew up, in these like underfunded communities. But the page and its owners, it appears, they went through this process of radicalization, or like understanding the degree to which a performance of radicalization was lucrative and could be lucrative for them. And that's what I was talking about with the reverse metamorphosis thing, is that like, this is a page that was initially a landing spot for Black and brown people, for marginalized people. That same page then turned brown people into racist fodder in a bid to attract a new kind of audience, and that's where this idea of betrayal, I think, comes into play. Like, they built this audience initially by creating these relationships with marginalized people in their city, but they now use those very identities to drive race panic and immigration panic to an audience that they are trying to appeal to, right? And like, they're now serving these people to whom they owe their success in its entirety on a platter. And they're presenting them as like an internal horde, as a scary alien population. I think the logic of that is really troubling. And like, essentially the kind of base premise of 6ixBuzz today is fear. It's crime panic, health panic, immigration panic. It is a project that's really indistinguishable from that of like Breitbart under Steve Bannon, or even Rebel News. Like, like driving fear and hysteria, the kind of brand that trades on our worst impulses, that uses fear-mongering as like a vector for attention and clicks and ultimately revenue. And, like if you are interested in profit, it makes sense, but I think ethically it raises all kinds of questions. And like, just the last thing I'll say is that, to go back to what I said earlier as well, like, these are street guys running a fundamentally street enterprise. And I understand more than most, I think, that the conditions of life in the inner city and in community housing in Toronto can drive all kinds of desperation and a kind of mania for upward mobility. But like, when the hustler begins to destroy the world that he lifted himself out of, they should be subject to critique. And like, I think in some way that's what's happening here.
Well,
and I just want to pick up on something Matt said in terms of like the betrayal. Like, I mentioned how 6ixBuzz isn't the only account that's following this pattern, like posting anti-immigration type content, anti-South Asian content. It's perfect for engagement. You're going to get the rage. You're going to get the comments. When I talk to people in Brampton, when I talk to newcomers, to them it felt like it just stung so much more because they followed 6ixBuzz
because they trusted them.
It was like they're like new to the country. In some of these cases, they were like trying to get a sense of the communities that they were going to be a part of, which were in these peripheries of the GTA, which were in working class communities, and to then sort of hear it from them rather than instead of only far right organizations or white supremacist organizations, it hurts that much more.
I take the point that it also makes you more successful, though. The thing that Matt was just saying, the idea that like, you can build larger and larger success,
lucrative.
and find a larger and larger audience. And one of the things that you can do with that audience is you can, in fact, play a role in a federal election. It's not lost on me that the last time the three of us were together, we were here for the front burner election night live stream, in this very studio. And earlier we played a bit of 6ixBuzz's Q&A with Pierre Poilievre. This is a big deal because Pierre Poilievre barely talked to mainstream media at all. But then here he was doing this Q&A for 6ixBuzz. I'll ask you, what did you make of Poilievre's decision to make that video for 6ixBuzz specifically?
I think it's part of a new strategy that or a newish playbook that like a lot of politicians are following. It's not unique to Poilievre. Mark Carney didn't go on, mainstream media very much during the campaign either. I think 6ixBuzz is interesting because we've seen a sort of political bent in their coverage over the last few years. But Poilievre's not even the first. Doug Ford was like commenting on 6ixBuzz comments back in 2019.
Oh, wow.
But what I thought was interesting was back in 2019 when Doug Ford was in the comments, I saw articles that were like, why is Doug Ford commenting on 6ixBuzz posts? They like reached out to his people to kind of understand why that was happening. And they said, well, we're the digital is a huge part of our strategy. We're trying to reach, young people. In this case, clearly it's, you're going to reach young, diverse people, people of color.
Yeah.
So on Poilievre's part, I think it's a very obvious choice. In fact, just this morning, 6ixBuzz posted a video on their story of
Poilievre at UFC.
Yeah, he was at a UFC event in Montreal, and he's like talking to the camera, and he's just like, thanks to 6ixBuzz for keeping everyone informed. Now, where this gets muddy is if 6ixBuzz is supposed to be a news organization, do we know whether or not they reached out to any of the other party leaders during the campaign?
We
No.
would do that. CBC would do that. Every other news organization would do that.
Even Nardwar was like, I tried, but he didn't talk to me.
Yes, he was.
Yeah. So,
Sorry, I think the Poilievre stuff in particular is fascinating, because 6ixBuzz is essentially now parroting and miming the conventions of journalism without committing to any of them, which is kind of what Joy is getting at, right? Like we
the
have all these
standards.
standards and practices, exactly.
Yeah.
But they get to cosplay the trappings of a credible news agency, but invest, make none of the investment in the kind of project that requires, and it sets up this like incredibly mutually beneficial arrangement where politicians get to appear on a page that's targeted at the exact intersection that they're trying to attract most. They get to do so on a page that's performing journalism, but they don't have to face any of the scrutiny or the accountability that's typical of a real journalism interview. And like 6ixBuzz in return gets the clout and legitimacy of sitting down with an establishment politician. So like everyone is benefiting similarly from that. But I think one of the core themes here is that like first generation people in this country, of which all of us are kind of party to, many of the cultures that our parents left are inherently conservative. And like, were it not for certain like white identity politics that many people in our communities view as racist or racially problematic, many of our communities would probably be inclined to even vote conservative. And like 6ixBuzz have managed to recognize this before the mainstream media in this country, and probably even before the Conservative Party of Canada in some way. And they're just now tailoring a incredibly lucrative message to that exact intersection of people.
I genuinely could keep talking about this forever, but I am genuinely out of time. But I have so many more questions for you guys, but I really appreciate you guys being here. Thank you so much for this conversation. Really appreciate it.
thanks for having
Thanks,
me.
Elamin. Appreciate it.
Yes, of course. Matt Amha is a writer and culture critic from Toronto, and Joytha Sengupta, my bad, is a producer at CBC News. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. I'm going to shift gears now because I want to tell you about the country's newest music label. It was founded by my next guest, Tristan Grant, also known as the rapper Wolf Castle. He launched this label with this song by the Hello Crows. That is a bit of Warbler by the Hello Crows. That's the first band signed to Castle Records. But here's the bigger deal, okay? Tristan's label is a huge milestone for Atlantic Canada. It's the first Indigenous music label to be launched there. Tristan Grant, thank you for being here, man, and congratulations to you.
Thanks a lot. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm glad you're, I'm glad people are excited about this.
Of course, man. Tell me about the decision. Why'd you launch a label?
I launched the label out of spite. No, man, I launched the label because, like, when you're an independent musician in trying to make it, you wear every possible hat you could wear, like marketing, promotion, blah, blah, blah. The last thing you end up doing is making music. So, I was so sick and tired of seeing, musicians that were really talented and really great get no support or not have the guidance to know where to go. And I tend to be a bit of a go-getter, I
see that about you.
I learned a lot about the business side of things and how to do that. And I felt like, there were artists I was surprised weren't well versed in all of that and how that worked. And I thought, this is a time to definitely be protective and make our community stronger, our Indigenous artists, because we're living in a time where that's being exploited to a certain degree because there's funding and there's attention, and I think as we get more mainstream, we got to stay in the conversation.
Okay, so this is a huge deal, man. The first Indigenous music label to be launched in the East Coast. You already signed your first group. That's a Hello Crows. When you go to them, what do you say? What's your pitch to them to be like, hey, forget everything else, sign with me. I'm your guy.
Yeah, I was really nervous to do it because I just feel like some dude walking around like, hey, man, I got a label. But which happens in the entertainment industry.
Sure.
I just told them, like I really believed in their music and they're a great band. And time again, I see acts that are super great and end up kind of fizzling out. And I just felt like, no, we got to capture this lightning in a bottle. Like I can help you on that way. I know how hard it is to do this music thing without a team. And like they have management and they needed, a label, and they were talking with some other people. And I said, well, why not keep it, in the Indigenous sphere? Right. Like, and I think that they wanted to work with an Indigenous artist and with an Indigenous label. And that's kind of why I wanted to do it, because there's a huge gap in the market, I guess, for lack of a better term, where there are label people and music execs that don't really understand the culture and the language or what the Indigenous experience looks like. Like I've been told myself, like people are like, I don't even know how to market your music. And I'm like, okay, thanks, bro. So, I was like, hey, we're kind of from the same area. We're from the same place. Why don't we work together?
The idea that somebody will come to you and say, hey, man, I like your music, I don't know how to promote it. Like, that's the last thing that you want to hear. And so as a person who's now running this label, what are your dreams for the label, Tristan?
My dreams are certainly to elevate it to the national level. I mean, I'm happy I'm on this show promoting it and talking about it because it's getting that attention. I actually was surprised it got the attention, pleasantly so. But my dreams are certainly to make a label that protects those voices, gets people listening, and maybe people that aren't Indigenous will be willing to kind of come into that world and at least know that it's the music that's released and the way it's being treated is coming from a place of love and a place of authenticity, because I feel like sometimes that can get lost, especially if you're signing with maybe major labels or places that are a little more corporate, So that's my dream for it.
Just in this moment right now, as you sort of, launch Castle Records and you try to tell people about it, what's the best response to the new label they've gotten so far?
The best response to the new label, I mean, I love being called the only Atlantic Canadian Indigenous label in the whole country.
Well,
I found that really highlighted the problem that I noticed. Right? Like, and especially like all the love I've been getting just from everybody. Like I spent maybe a whole weekend trying to catch up on messages from people. Like clearly this was something that was needed and people were looking for, and maybe they didn't even know they were looking for it. But just that wave of love is fantastic. And honestly, it's motivating me to work harder and want to actually, live up to what I'm trying to do, because sometimes I'm worried, I don't want to be just a really good salesman with nothing to follow it up with. So now I guess the ball's in my court.
Now that the ball's in your court, how do you think you want to make it easier for the Indigenous artists that you sign from Atlantic Canada to get heard across the country?
Well, I think that part of it is I want to make sure I work directly with artists and I'm really responsive with them and transparent about what my label deals look like, and also like where the attention is being focused. Like something I like to do with people, if they don't know already, like musicians are smart and scrappy and they understand this business and how to learn, but there's always gaps. There's always gaps everywhere, and I have them too. But like when I work with artists or have spoken to them, I make sure they know about music publishing and how that works and how that's broken down, and how, you might not want to put all your music out on DistroKid, like a faceless corporation that might take 50% of your publishing if you end up being a big artist. Just little things like that. And I try to be educational about it. And I think that that's something that's really important. Is I always want to make sure that the artists understand the business that they're in and aren't left in the dark.
Tristan, I bet they appreciate hearing it from an artist because you're an artist yourself. I really appreciate your time, man, and good luck on the label. This is great news. Thanks so much again.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it, man.
Yes, of course. Tristan Grant is a Mi'kmaq rapper and producer from the Papineau First Nation. He performs as Wolf Castle. He's also the founder of Castle Records in Fredericton, New Brunswick. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. We'll be back tomorrow. I'll see you then.